I kind of look at myself and go like, how the hell did I not get this before?
Hands up! Hands up!
This system is killing people. We're 400 years into it.
Say his name!
Do you ever think about what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and think, well, that could be me, or that could be my boy?
I think it could be me, Joyce.
I want a police officer, when they see my black son, to see their white sons.
How do you solve a problem if you ignore the cause?
What do you think is the core issue here that allows something like this to happen?
Racism.
It's not going to be an easy conversation, and it's not going to be over quick, but we have to start.
This holiday season will be different for many reasons. Most families won't be crowded around the dinner table as usual. And we have so much on our minds: the pandemic, our finances, the election, and social justice. I'm Joyce Taylor. Welcome to Facing Race. So many of you have shared your personal stories with us of how you're beginning to understand your own bias. You're talking to your kids about race. You're exploring the lesser-known forms of racism. 3 best-selling authors have been part of our King 5 original series, lending their expertise on how we can all become anti-racist. Tonight, we're revisiting some of our most talked about stories that began this past summer with an awakening to the systemic racism in our country. It's something that, as we know, has existed for centuries, but now protesters are demanding people start paying attention.
I can't breathe!
This man's life matters.
I'm out here to get justice.
Police in Minneapolis have started to disperse a large crowd.
Protests have broken out across the U.S., including several in our region.
We want peace. We don't want to be killed. We don't want to be hurt.
Hands up! Hands up!
It's the most we've seen since the 60s, a generation of people for the first time seeing protests like this.
If you're fed up, then this is your time, this is your moment to say something.
Say his name! Say his name!
Protesters want justice for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Manuel Ellis, and other Black lives taken too soon. But the movement doesn't stop there. It has put the spotlight on a deep-rooted issue in our country: privilege, the kind that has nothing to do with wealth or prestige. Kristen Ayers explains.
You might think racism in the U.S. is really a case of a few bad apples. A racist cop here, a so-called Karen there, a leader of a white supremacist group. You know, people who deliberately hate. But we can't blame racism in America on just a few bad apples. Think of our nation's problem as more like an apple pie, with the racial injustice baked right into every aspect of our society. Meet Ebony and Emily, 2 American babies, 1 black, 1 white, born at the same time, same place, but Ebony will not get an equal slice of the pie, and that starts from birth. Because of her race, Ebony is 3 times more likely than Emily to die in the hospital as a newborn if her doctor is white. And once Ebony and Emily go to school, while both girls occasionally misbehave, studies show they won't face the same punishment. Ebony is 7 times more likely than Emily to be suspended, and 4 times more likely to be arrested on campus. When the 2 girls grow up and apply for jobs, odds are fewer employers will call Ebony back because she has a black-sounding name. And even though Emily and Ebony will get the same college degree, once Ebony is hired statistically as a black person, she'll make an average of 25% less than Emily. So why didn't Ebony get an equal slice of that apple pie? It's because systemic racism is built into our country's DNA. In the 17th and 18th centuries, wealthy white men needed land, so they took it from indigenous people and then forced blacks into slavery. To justify using blacks for free labor, the whites in power promoted a myth that blacks were inferior. And as Seattle-based author Ijoma Oluo points out, our nation's institutions, politics, and policies were designed against the backdrop of that money-driven lie that Black people just weren't as worthy or as capable as whites.
Our school systems were built around this, our economic systems are built around this, our government systems were built around this. And it is simply that things were designed to uphold this story, to uphold this exploitation.
And even though slavery ended here more than 150 years ago, the racism that fueled it persists in systemic ways today. White Americans now hold 85% of this country's wealth. Black Americans, just over 4%, and Hispanics, just over 3%. People of color, people like Ebony, are statistically more likely to be impoverished, incarcerated, and face discrimination in healthcare. Emily may have her own barriers in life, but her skin color won't be one of them.
It's not someone said, here's your wealth because you're white, here's your status because you're white. It simply means that the barriers that we placed in front of people of color were not placed in front of you. Now you may have a whole nother set of barriers, right? You may have barriers of disability, barriers of class, barriers of immigration status, so many other barriers that were placed in front of you. But acknowledging privilege is simply acknowledging if we also took that other set of barriers that we place in front of people of color, you would stumble even further.
So even though you may not consider yourself a bad apple, a racist cop, a so-called Karen, or a member of an extremist group, Oluo says you may have played a role, even if you have the best intentions.
Instead of this whole, let's all learn to be best friends and love each other, you can love someone of a different race and ethnicity and still actively participate in their oppression based on how you vote, based on what you bring up in your office meetings, based on where you spend your money.
It's not too late to change the recipe of the most American apple pie.
In our first episode, we asked you, when did you realize your race mattered? So many of you shared your stories with us, and we learned it didn't matter a person's age. Almost every person of color could name that moment when they knew their race mattered. White people found the question more difficult to answer.
When did you realize your race mattered?
My race what?
When did you realize your race mattered?
You know, I don't know if I can answer that question. I don't know if I still know my race matters.
I kind of look at myself and go like, how the hell did I not get this before? Why do I have to be 50 years old, live in Seattle in a blue bubble, and it still took me this long to figure out? With a lot of friends of color, too.
During school, lots of people criticize Asians and stuff, that they have to be like smart or that they have to have like a yellow tint in their skin or their eyes are always like tiny and stuff.
Growing up, kids of color are often reminded their race matters. And the fear for many parents is that one of those moments could put them in danger. And that's why we talk to our kids about how to act while Black in school, while they're shopping, and especially when they interact with police. Former NBA player Eldridge Hasner let us come along as he had the talk with his son, believing that someday it could save his life.
Hey, partner.
The simple act of running an errand, driving to work, picking up a friend. To Black families such as the Hasners of Bellevue, there's nothing simple about it.
Just make sure you have your hands visible where you can see them and that you're being real respectful. Yes, officer, no officer, when they ask you a question and when you answer. All right?
This is Eldridge Hasner and his 16-year-old son, Manny, going through the paces of what's called the talk.
You don't say a word until they come up to the window and ask you to roll down the window if your window's up.
One generation to the next, explaining how to act if a police officer were to pull you over.
But you don't say anything until they ask you something. And I want to you to keep your hands either where I have my hands at right here on the steering wheel or on the dashboard so they can see them at all times.
It's a rundown of what to do and what not to do to make sure your child isn't shot during a stop. If you're white, that may sound dramatic, but to Black families across the country, it feels as necessary as learning how to back up or park the car.
America done painted this picture of the black person, especially the black male, that he's a threat. It's sad, and I don't think there's a lot of other races of people out there that have that burden that they got to carry with them all the time.
Rick Hasner is a former NBA player and UW Hall of Famer.
Hasner for 3.
And while he calls the Northwest home, his heart is in New Orleans. He was raised in the city's segregated, nearly all-black 9th Ward.
I remember as a kid in St. Bernard Parish seeing the Ku Klux Klan in full gear, standing on the corner taking donations.
Racism. He knows what it looks like, then and now.
I've been shopping Home Depot for probably 35 years, and still to this day when I go in there, the security guys follow me around.
For nearly 3 decades, Eldridge and his wife Karen have lived on the East Side. They're the proud parents of 4.
Raising our kids out here, I think, has given them a false sense of security.
That's how she felt growing up in Seattle, until one Mother's Day. She'd just moved to West Seattle. She was 12 when hate came crashing into her living room.
There was a bag on the ground, like a brown bag, and had a rock in it, and it said, "Get out, niggas," on the bag. And so, of course, I freaked out and, told my mom, and we opened the door, and they had spray painted KKK on the door.
A tense day in Charlottesville.
Fast forward, and the stories have changed. But communities of color will tell you, just look around, and the hate remains.
Do you ever think about what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and think, well, that could be me, or that could be my boy?
I think it could be me, Joyce.
Or his son. And because of that, Manny says he's taking the talk to heart.
I see people on the news, black people, black men, getting killed for no reason, and I don't want to be like them.
Another generation learning about policing and the rules of the road. Will there ever be a time families of color won't have to have these conversations?
Joyce, I don't think that's ever going to change. I want a police officer, when they see my black son, to see their white sons.
Alexis Harris is a sociology professor at the University of Washington. She says because of decades of ingrained racism, she doesn't see massive change coming in our lifetimes.
I think I try to be optimistic when I teach. I try to be optimistic with my students, but we've had 400 years in this country of enslavement to control.
And that's just how it is. And I think it's going to stay like that. I'm sure our children are going to have the same conversations with their kids, unfortunately.
If you ever get pulled over by a police officer and you don't think that they're being fair for you, you have a right to call 911. I don't care what level you reach financially, status-wise, class-wise. If you're black, you're going to have this conversation with your sons, and that's sad.
The talk is one way we cope with racism. Native Americans face another kind that we don't often talk about: environmental racism. Michael Crow takes us to Eastern Washington, where, in some ways, the land has become a liability.
This is home for the Spokane Tribe, their reservation in eastern Washington, northwest of the city of Spokane. Tucked in the Selkirk Mountains, the tribe has lived on this land since the reservation was established in 1881 and in the area long before. But these forests are also home to something else.
There's just a feeling, I get sick to my stomach.
Rich deposits of uranium. In the atomic sprint of the Cold War, some of the raw material came from here, the Midnight Mine. When it closed in 1981, it left a massive pit and a slew of environmental problems, toxins leaching into the groundwater, spreading into the soil, and a risk of human exposure to these contaminants.
They found it on Indian lands, and it was opened up for companies to come in and pay minimal for the resources.
4 decades later, and tribal member Twala Abrahamson-Swan is still working to get the reservation cleaned up. And her fight is not just against dangerous pollution, but also a larger issue: environmental racism.
My name is Isabel Carreras Amanillo. I work at University of Washington in the College of the Environment as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program Specialist.
She teaches a course on race and the environment exploring this issue.
Environmental racism was a concept that started being used in the United States between the 70s and 80s to denote those disproportionate impact on communities of color.
With the valuable natural resource of uranium on the reservation, this is a textbook case of environmental racism. First, the government moved the tribe to this land as white settlers expanded across the U.S.
When allotments were being made, our people were pushed to the mountain areas because at that time, a lot of the farmlands were more desirable.
But that rare uranium brought the government back. This is where the Midnight Mill stood at the edge of the reservation. The reminders today are everywhere. The mine area is so contaminated, it's an EPA Superfund cleanup site. The federal agency sued the owners, Newmont Mining, to bring them back and clean it up. But the process will take years.
Because it's contamination that you really can't see or smell, so they could be going generations and generations drinking the water, breathing contaminated air and not know it.
It strikes me, I look out at this and it's this incredible, beautiful landscape, but you know from studies and from these signs, right, like that this has been poisoned, basically.
I think it's a delicate balance between, too much fear in the impacts that people may get from eating the fish or eating the wildlife. We really don't want to discourage people away from that because ultimately that's the healthiest thing for them and their families. But our wildlife are impacted, our fish are impacted.
And people, too. The tribe says there is a cluster of rare health problems among their members.
We had a span of about 3 months and we lost 10 tribal members to cancer during that time. And it was an eye-opener.
The impacts of environmental racism reach well beyond the Spokane Tribe. A 2015 paper in the journal Geosciences notes, the legacy of uranium procurement has left a legacy of long-lived health effects for many Native Americans and Alaska Natives in the United States. It's been a major issue for the Navajo people as well, with over 500 abandoned uranium mines on their land.
The Midnight Mine is upstream and drains into Blue Creek here, which drains into the Spokane River and then into the Columbia River.
And here on the reservation near Blue Creek, they worry about what's happening from the laundry list of toxic chemicals found in the water, air, and soil, and in the plants and animals that can't read these signs.
So in combination, what do all of these as a mixture do to the human body? And it's not studied.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but it sounds like at some level, this place is killing people.
Yes.
That must be hard to sit with.
It's hard to sit with. I think we had a good day.
But for Twala, the fallout of environmental racism is extremely real and especially painful.
I was diagnosed with leiomyosarcoma cancer in 2016. For me, it's associated with that mine site.
This is her mother, Deb Abrahamson. Her cancer is terminal.
It angers me. It angers me that I'm in this situation.
We just immediately focused on just our own spending time with each other, continuing to go to the mountains, continuing to do these activities as a family so we wouldn't forget those things.
What do you think is the core issue here that allows something like this to happen?
Racism, because when our country was invaded, we were viewed as a dispensable population, and so it was easy to be able to do the level of damage that has occurred on tribal lands because the people are subhuman, viewed as subhuman, and have no rights and have no say in how we conduct our lives.
Back at UW, Zamanillo says fighting environmental racism means we all should think about the impacts of the products we buy and consume. But also, she says we must continually include impacted communities in the solutions.
It's not just about solving the problems, but also listening to these communities and collaborating.
Which is what is on Twala's mind.
What we see is decisions made on behalf of the community are at the root of some of the problems, because when you don't have the impacted community in the room at all levels, these are the people that we're going to have to live with this decision for our entire life.
Because they want to move past life as a uranium-impacted community. the impacts of environmental racism.
The land is beautiful, so wonderful. Yet, when you look underneath, it's a deadly, toxic slime that isn't going to go away, and it's stuck on our people.
The Abrahamsons are now calling for better health monitoring for the tribe, hoping to catch issues earlier. We asked Newmont about their health concerns, and they responded saying, Newmont Don have no information that any tribal member's health has been impacted by the mine. All employees at the site participate in a comprehensive health and safety program to ensure safe working conditions are maintained and that no contamination leaves the site. Similarly, exposure levels are regularly monitored and reported to authorities. We can all agree the country is deeply divided right now on the pandemic, on politics, and race. Usually these are topics that are considered taboo, but they often come up around the holiday dinner table. We talked to a mediation expert about how to communicate when we don't agree. How is it that we are so polarized over almost everything in this country right now?
So what we need to be able to do is to push a little reset button. And the reset button is actually an ability to appreciate who each other are, the ability to actually see the other person as somebody who is not hostile to you, but somebody that you can learn from.
How do we begin to push that reset button when a lot of people don't recognize that they need to actually push it?
I think that the answer is to ask a question that can't be answered with a simple yes or no answer. So, for example, there are two ways of having a conversation about politics right now. One is one person says Trump, the other says Biden. One says Trump again, the other says Biden again. That basically is not going to get us anywhere. But the question we can ask is, what would a conversation look like if no one was allowed to use the words Trump or Biden? What would we talk about? How would we talk about it? What kinds of questions might we ask?
What is your advice for families that are going to be delving into these issues, knowing that there's not going to be agreement?
Ask a question that tries to identify what the issues are without trying to blame anybody for those issues. And secondly, to ask questions that draw people into dialogue. For example, what life experiences have you had that have led you to feel so passionately about this issue?
What do you say to Black Americans who feel some of the differing opinions on systemic racism, for example, are a threat to their very existence?
Well, the first thing that I would say is that if we want to know whether racism exists, do we ask a white person or a Black person? If we want to know whether sexism exists, do we ask a woman or a man? And the answer is, of course, we have to ask the person who is going to be most sensitive to the existence of these issues. And the difficulty with any large historical shift, such as the one that we are going through now, is that people's ideas about themselves, their lives, their relationships, all start to shift. And there can be some pain in that shift. And I saw it during the civil rights movement. I saw it afterwards. I think that the real work here has to be done by the white community in sort of recognizing, acknowledging the role that it has played in the history of this country. The fact that we have never come to terms with what we have done to African Americans or to Native Americans or to Latinos, I know from personal experience that it is possible for us to open those conversations now. It's not going to be an easy conversation, and it's not going to be over quick, but we have to start.
So where do we go from here? We asked the man who wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram X. Kendi, about what it takes.
It's not enough to be aware. We need you as part of this struggle. If an American can look out at their country, and not just a country that's unraveling for people of color, but for white people, for everyone, then I'm not sure what they're looking at. How can we just sit around while while the country is unraveling.
A local artist is taking action by putting his pen to paper, creating portraits of people who've lost their lives to police violence. As Taylor Murphy-Dureski shows us, for him, it's all about timing.
I feel eager to start his piece, even though I know it won't be finished. Seeing that he was from Kent and was killed by Kent police officers definitely caught my eye. You know, the idea of time and how fragile it feels for some, but not all. I think this is a good way to bring that to paper. My name is Adrian Brandon. I've been working on a series called Stolen, which focuses on Black lives lost by the hands of the police. Luckily, a lot of artists do create these beautiful portraits of these victims, and that is needed. I think it's great to celebrate the lives that they did have, but I really want to kind of show the lives that they didn't have. Tamir Rice was 12 years old. This is Chantel Davis. She was 23 years old. This is Miriam Carey. She was 34 years old. I will set a timer, so if they were 18 years old, I'll set a timer for 18 minutes. For every minute or every year that they lived, I spend that long within minutes of painting that piece. So Giovanni was 20 years old when he was killed. I kind of push the timer to the side. I don't look at it, and so that creates this sense of panic while I'm creating the piece, knowing that the time is going down and I'm not going to be able to finish the whole portrait. I'm feeling very anxious, kind of stressed out, and these feelings are supposed to mimic the feelings that Black people feel living in America today. We're not afforded the luxury to always be at ease when the cops pull us over. When the timer hits, it's a range of emotions. I feel sadness first and foremost, heartbreak that was it. Trying to picture what the full piece would have looked like had there been no timer. It's frustrating as an artist just to not be able to finish a piece and then to realize that that represents something so much more intense and emotional, and that it's a life that wasn't complete. You know, it's a way for me to grieve. So I'm left with this unfinished piece, and the viewer is left curious about what would more time have allowed. What would it look like if I did have 20, 30, 40 more minutes, 2 hours to complete the piece? And that's what families are left with. They're left with, okay, what was our son gonna be? He was 18 when he was killed. Was he gonna, live out his dreams to be X, Y, and Z, or, it just gets people thinking. That's the whole point of this, is for them to see these faces and say, oh, first of all, why isn't the face covered? Where were they from? What did they like to do? How did they get killed? So when you see the whole series with 50 names and stories out there, this isn't just Michael Brown. This isn't just Tamir Rice or Sandra Bland or George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. This is a whole list of names that we've been trying to grieve and seek justice for and support one another with.
To watch any of the stories that we've done this season or to check out our resource guide, go to king5.com/facingrace. And thank you for spending your time with us tonight. We hope to see you back here again next week. Good night.